The night after my husband's funeral, my daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table, the scent of lilies from the service still heavy in the air, and she said, "Mom, you can't handle that kind of money." I was still in black, my hands still shaking from grief, and already she was planning how to take what little comfort I had left. The check from his life insurance policy lay folded in an envelope on the counter, untouched, unopened, because I hadn't yet found the strength to see his name in print one last time. But she knew it was there, she knew the amount, she knew more than I did because she had called the insurance company herself under the guise of helping me. "It's too much for you to manage," she said, tapping her nails on the wood. "You're not used to dealing with numbers this big. You'll make mistakes, you'll lose it." I stared at her, my own child, my only daughter, the girl I raised on casseroles and second-hand clothes, the girl whose shoes I polished before every school recital, the girl whose tears I kissed away, and I thought, how quickly love can turn to hunger when money enters the room. I didn't answer that night. I just folded my hands, whispered that I was tired, and went to bed with the echo of her words lodged in my chest like a splinter. The next morning I woke to the sound of papers shuffling in the kitchen. She was on the phone, speaking softly. "Yes, that's the account. Yes, my mother, but I'll be handling it soon." When she saw me in the doorway, she smiled too brightly, like a child caught with stolen candy, and hung up. "I was just checking rates for you," she said. "You shouldn't have to bother with all the details." I said nothing, poured myself coffee, and made a silent vow. I may be grieving, but I am not blind. The days that followed blurred with condolences, casseroles dropped off by neighbors, cards stacked on the mantel, but through it all she hovered like a shadow. She moved my husband's photos into a box, saying, "You shouldn't torment yourself," but I saw how her eyes lingered not on his face but on the envelope of money. She brought me glossy brochures for investment opportunities, telling me about friends who doubled their savings, who lived off interest alone. I wanted to shout that I didn't care about doubling anything, that I would give it all back just to hear his voice one more time. But she wasn't listening, she only heard numbers. One evening she cornered me in the living room. "Mom," she said, voice tight, "if you don't do something smart with that money, you'll lose it." "And then what?" "You'll be a burden." "Do you really want to end up like Grandma?" She knew exactly where to strike. My own mother had died poor, her savings squandered by a second husband, and I had sworn never to repeat that fate. I clenched my fists and said, "This is my money, my husband's last gift to me. I'll decide what to do with it." Her smile faltered, just for a moment, then returned sharper, colder. "Of course, Mom," she said. "I just don't want you making mistakes you'll regret." But I saw it then, the greed behind the mask, the calculation in her eyes. She didn't want to help me. She wanted to control me. That night, alone in bed, I finally opened the envelope. The check sat heavy in my hands, so many zeros they blurred through my tears. I thought of all the years my husband worked late, the calluses on his palms, the sweat on his brow, and I whispered, "You earned this, and now she wants to take it." I pressed the paper to my chest like it was his heartbeat, and I swore I would not let it be stolen. The next morning I took out an old notebook, the same one I had used once to keep track of bills when we were young and broke. On the first page I wrote, "He died, she asked for the money." And under it I added, "Watch her." Because I knew this was not grief speaking through her, it was hunger, and hunger never stops until it is fed or starved. Grief makes people speak in soft voices and hard intentions, and within a week my daughter had perfected both. She arrived with muffins and a new tone that sounded like velvet wrapped around a demand. She said, "Mom, everyone's asking how you're handling finances." And when I asked who exactly everyone was, she said, Aunt Lisa, the neighbors, my book club, Pastor Ron, people care, and I smiled the way a wounded animal shows teeth, because care does not check the balance before it brings you soup, and she set down a glossy folder with tabs labeled budget, invest, consolidate, as if my husband's life had been a file system waiting to be archived under her name. She started small, always small. Let's just list your passwords so I can help pay bills. And I said, the bills are paid. And she said, of course, for now. And I heard the unspoken, for now, well, you still know what day it is. She was clever. She didn't call me forgetful. She called me overwhelmed, a word that deposits pity in your lap and asks for your keys. And by Thursday she had orchestrated a family dinner where the relatives arrived with casseroles and opinions. Aunt Lisa squeezing my hand too long, saying, honey, at our age it's best to simplify. And my cousin Tom chiming in about a great guy at the firm who takes it all off your plate. And my daughter pretending to object. No pressure, Mom, we just want what's best, while sliding a business card across the table with the man's name embossed like a threat. I tucked the card into my pocket, smiled at the crowd like a hostess, and thought of the night my husband and I ate cold beans from a can because the power company had shut us off, and how we lit a candle and laughed anyway. I had handled worse than a room full of scavengers in nice shoes. She did not stop. She called the bank just to set up alerts. She forwarded me an email from a wealth manager with bullet points that sounded like sirens. She texted at midnight, Mom, we need to protect you from scammers. And I wanted to answer, the scammer is in my kitchen. But I wrote, we'll talk tomorrow. And in the morning I dressed in my good jacket, the one that makes bank tellers look me in the eye. And I went alone to the branch where Gloria, whose son I once drove to soccer for 3 years, printed me statements and quietly said, if anyone tries to add themselves to your accounts without you present, we will call you. Would you like a password on the profile phrase only you and I know? And I said, yes, make it the name of the dog we lost in '98. And we both smiled because grief can be a lock as well as a wound. When I returned, my daughter was at the table with the glossy folder open to a page titled Joint Account, Temporary, and she said brightly, it's just until you're back on your feet. And I heard my husband's laugh in my chest, the one he used when the car wouldn't start in winter, and I said, my feet never sat down, and she blinked, recalculated, reached for a softer lie, okay, maybe a small transfer, just to keep it safe from taxes, and I said, safety lives where I can see it. And she exhaled like I had slapped her, then stood and busied herself with the kettle the way guilty people stir air. The pressure bled into the neighborhood as if she had opened a vein. Mrs. Green from church stopped me on my walk to say delicately, your daughter tells me you're considering a trust, smart move, and I said, I'm considering a cup of tea, and walked on. And at the market Mr. Diaz at the butcher counter asked, are you traveling now that you inherited? And I understood then that the number had escaped its envelope and taken up residence in other people's mouths. That night my daughter arrived with a man in a navy blazer who introduced himself as Evan, just Evan, think of me as family, and I thought, family does not bring a leather portfolio to a mother's grief. But I said hello and listened while he drew cheerful arrows on a pad. We park the principal here, spin off dividends there, small management fee, your daughter as co-signer for efficiency. And when I asked who holds the keys he smiled at my daughter and said, we do. And I smiled back, a different animal entirely, and said, then no. And he blinked, and used to women who do not apologize for owning their own breath. And my daughter's hand tightened around her pen until it clicked like a tiny metronome counting down to an outburst. After he left she dropped the smile and said, you're making this difficult. And I said, no, I am making this mine. And she said, do you want to lose it to taxes, to inflation, to bad actors? And I said, I have already lost my husband. The rest is just numbers that sit still until someone greedy shakes the jar. and her face went flat the way a stage goes dark, and she whispered, "Dad would never forgive you for wasting it," a blade disguised as a memory, and I stood so fast the chair legs shrieked, and I said, "Do not use your father's name as a crowbar," and for a heartbeat I saw fear cross her features because the dead do not defend the living but the living can still roar. I did not sleep. I sat at the table and opened my old notebook and wrote, "She brought a man to my grief. She called theft efficiency. She tried to conjure your ghost against me." In the morning I called the credit union 2 towns over, the one we used back when the bank wouldn't approve our first mortgage, and opened a separate account in my name only, small at first, a testing of doors, then larger, moving slowly, methodically. No sudden withdrawals to raise alarms, and I set up paper statements mailed to my post office box, not the house, because even daughters read mail when they think you nap. Over breakfast she tried a new tactic, sweeter, Mom. We could invest together, mother-daughter, it would be special, and the word special tasted like rust, and I said, I prefer ordinary, bills paid, lights on, no portfolios, and her smile cracked. Just a hairline, but enough that I could see the shape of the hunger beneath. By Sunday she had enlisted Pastor Ron, just a conversation about stewardship, he said gently in my doorway, and I poured him coffee and told him how stewardship begins with not coveting your neighbor's goods even when the neighbor is your mother, and his ears reddened and he left with his empty sermon notes. That night my daughter sent a long message, a thicket of concern. "I'm worried about elder scams, Mom. I've heard terrible stories. Let me protect you. Let me help." And I typed, slowly, so each letter set like a brick, "I am not a story. I am the person who kept a roof over you when the roof leaked. I will ask for help when I want it. Until then, stop." She did not stop. But my spine, which grief had softened, began to harden around a single truth. Love without respect is a hand in your pocket, and I have spent my life paying for other people's lessons. This one, finally, would be hers. Grief is supposed to make families cling tighter, but in my house it made the walls thinner, it made whispers travel like drafts. Within a month of his death I realized my daughter wasn't waiting for me to heal, she was circling like a hawk, watching for a stumble. She started showing up unannounced, letting herself in with the spare key she claimed was for emergencies. I'd find her in the study going through drawers, sighing, just trying to organize Dad's papers, though her eyes were always on the filing cabinet where I'd locked away the insurance documents. One morning I came down and found my husband's watch missing from the mantel. When I asked, she shrugged and said, "I thought I'd hold on to it before it gets lost." Lost. As if I were the kind of woman who misplaces 40 years of memories on a shelf. Soon she began testing me in small ways, leaving bills half open on the counter, asking, "Did you forget to pay this one?" even though I had already written the check. When I showed her the receipt she laughed it off, but I wrote the date in my notebook all the same. Another day she set a stack of bank letters in front of me and asked me to explain the numbers, as if I hadn't been balancing a household budget since before she was born. "You always relied on Dad," she said sweetly. "I just don't want you overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. That word again, soft like a pillow pressed over a face. It didn't stop with me. At church Mrs. Paulson leaned over during coffee hour and whispered, "Your daughter tells me you're thinking of letting her manage things. Good choice." At the market Mr. Diaz asked, "So you're planning to downsize, yes?" And I realized she wasn't just circling me, she was painting me for the world, spreading a picture of a woman too fragile to trust herself. I smiled at them all, nodded politely, then went home and wrote in the notebook, "She is building a stage, and I am meant to be the fool on it." The worst came the day she brought her son, my grandson, into it. He's only 12, but children hear more than we think. He asked me quietly, "Grandma, are you sick? Mom says you might forget stuff with money." I felt my throat close. I knelt down, looked him in the eye, and said, "Sweetheart, I raised your mother through winters with no heat. I counted every dime to keep the lights on. I am not sick. I am strong. Don't let anyone tell you different." He nodded, but the doubt was already there, planted like a weed. That night my daughter confronted me directly. "You need to give me control," she said, voice sharp now, no more velvet. "This is too much for you. If you don't, you'll regret it." I told her calmly, "The only thing I regret is raising a child who confuses greed with love." Her face hardened. "Dad would have wanted me to handle this," she hissed, and I stood so fast the chair scraped across the floor. "Your father trusted me for 40 years, I said. "He left this money because he believed I could survive without him. Don't you dare rewrite his faith." She stormed out, slamming the door, but I knew it was only the beginning. And as I sat alone with the silence, I thought of the night before the funeral, when I touched the envelope and felt it heavy as stone. He had left me a weapon, though he never meant it that way, and now I had to decide, let it be stolen, or wield it to defend myself. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Today she used his name as a blade. I will not let her cut me twice." I should have known she wouldn't be satisfied with whispers and suggestions, because greed is never patient, it grows restless when it isn't fed. The first sign came in the form of a letter I never requested, an offer from a brokerage firm congratulating me on recent account activity. I knew instantly it was her. She had tried to open something in my name. I took the letter, walked straight to the branch, and confirmed it. Someone had used my information but failed to provide the correct verification phrase, the name of the dog we lost in '98. The clerk shook her head, said it happens more often than people think, but I could see pity in her eyes, the kind reserved for widows whose own children circle them like wolves. I walked home with the letter in my purse and fury in my veins. The next week my daughter appeared with a bright smile and 2 coffee cups. "I thought we could go through some forms together," she said lightly, sliding a manila folder across the table. Inside were bank transfer documents with my name already filled in. "It's just a precaution," she said. "In case something happens to you." I stared at the line where my signature was meant to go, the empty space that would give her everything, and I pushed the folder back across the table. "Nothing is happening to me," I said. "Except losing patience." Her smile froze. "Mom, don't be stubborn. This is for your protection." I leaned forward. "Protection from what?" "From you?" For a moment her eyes flickered, raw and furious, then she laughed too loudly. "God, you're so dramatic." But the folder disappeared back into her bag like a snake retreating into grass. She escalated from there. I noticed one of my checkbooks missing. When I confronted her, she acted insulted. "You probably misplaced it. You know you get flustered sometimes." Flustered. Another word like a knife hidden in velvet. I didn't argue. Instead, I called the bank and canceled the series of checks. 2 days later, the fraud department confirmed that one had been used at a boutique across town. When they showed me the copy, the signature was a clumsy imitation of my name. My daughter's handwriting had always been rounder than mine, but to strangers it might have passed. I felt sick. She wasn't just circling me anymore. She had bitten. At church the whispers grew sharper. Mrs. Paulson told me she'd heard I was having trouble managing funds. My cousin called to ask if I was safe. My own grandson asked if I was going to lose the house. Each word was a stone laid on my chest, and I knew who carried them there. She wanted me isolated, cornered, desperate enough to hand her the keys. But I wasn't raised to hand over anything. I had survived winters with empty pantries, bills stacked like fortresses, and a husband whose hands bled so mine didn't have to. I would survive my own child's betrayal too. That night I opened my notebook and wrote every detail: the brokerage letter, the forged check, the whispers that were not whispers but poison she poured with my name attached. I hid copies in 3 places: under the laundry room tile, behind the photo of our wedding, inside the hollow of the sewing machine. If she wanted war, she would find I had already built fortresses. The final straw came when she tried to convince me I had lost money myself. I checked my account one morning and saw a withdrawal I hadn't made. When I asked her, she clutched her pearls and said, "Oh, Mom, you must have forgotten. Maybe you bought something online." My stomach dropped. She thought I was so broken, so weak with grief, that I would doubt my own memory. But I had the receipts, the checkbook balanced down to the cent, the notebook with every transaction. I looked her in the eye and said, "Do not confuse my grief for weakness." I buried my husband, not my mind. She stared at me, lips parting, then pressed her palms flat against the table. "You'll ruin everything," she whispered. "You'll throw it all away. And when it's gone, don't expect me to pick up the pieces." She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the window rattled. I sat there in the silence, shaking, but not from fear. From rage. She wanted me to sign away my husband's last gift, to let her steal what we had spent a lifetime building. She thought widowhood meant helplessness. She had forgotten who raised her, who taught her to count pennies into dollars, who stretched meals out of nothing. She had forgotten her mother's spine. That night I wrote in the notebook, she forged my name. She stole my checkbook. She spread rumors. She thinks grief makes me blind. But grief has given me sharper eyes. By the time spring crept in through the windows, my grief had thinned but her hunger had only fattened. She no longer limited herself to sly comments and missing checkbooks. She began parading strangers through my house as if auditioning them for the role of custodian of my life. One Saturday morning she showed up unannounced with a man in a tailored suit, his hair too perfect, his smile rehearsed. "This is David," she said cheerfully. "He helps families like ours plan responsibly." Families like ours. As though we were partners, as though my life's work had been co-signed by her ambition. David shook my hand too firmly, scanning the living room like it was already collateral, and launched into a speech about diversifying, consolidating, liquidating. I let him talk until his voice was just noise, then I interrupted, "And where in this plan do I get to breathe?" He blinked, thrown off script, and my daughter rushed to cover. "She's just overwhelmed," but I caught the flicker of irritation in her eyes, the look of someone whose puppet has slipped its strings. When they left, I wrote his name in the notebook and underlined it twice. She didn't stop there. At church potluck, she pulled aside Mrs. Green and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "I'm so worried about Mom. She can't manage all that money alone." Within days, half the congregation was approaching me with unsolicited advice, men with pamphlets about annuities, women with stories of cousins swindled by scams. I smiled at them all, thanked them for their concern, then went home and locked my door. The whispers had spread into vines, tangling around every corner of my life. One evening my neighbor, Carl, came by to return a dish and asked awkwardly, "So you really thinking of signing everything over to your daughter?" I froze. That was her plan all along, to make the idea sound inevitable, to weave it into the air so often that even I might breathe it in as truth. I laughed instead, sharp and bitter. "Carl, I've balanced my own checkbook longer than she's been alive." He looked embarrassed, muttered something about good intentions, and left. But I added his name to the list of those she had recruited into her theater. Then came the performance at the doctor's office. She insisted on accompanying me to a routine checkup, smiling sweetly at the receptionist, answering questions before I could, saying things like, "Mom gets flustered sometimes with forms," as if I weren't standing right there. When the doctor asked about stress, she leaned forward and said, "I worry she's not coping well," and I almost laughed out loud. Coping? I had survived burying my husband while she sharpened her knives. I answered calmly, firmly, listing my medications, my diet, my daily walks. The doctor looked at me, then at her, and I saw his brow furrow as though he sensed the performance. On the way out she hissed, "Why do you have to embarrass me?" Embarrass her. My grief was her stage, and she resented me for refusing to play the part of helpless widow. That night, after locking the doors, I sat at the kitchen table and pulled out the notebook. On one page I wrote every name she had dragged into her campaign: David the advisor, Mrs. Green, Carl, even the doctor's office staff. Then I turned to a fresh page and wrote a single word: countermove. Because watching her build her web had taught me one thing: I could not just defend, I had to act. The next morning I called Margaret, an old friend of mine who had spent 30 years as an accountant before retiring. We hadn't spoken in months, but when I told her what was happening, she said quietly, "Bring me everything, and bring it soon. If your daughter wants to turn numbers into a weapon, we'll turn them into a shield." I hung up and felt the smallest crack of light inside my chest. I realized then that this was not only about the money. It was about dignity. She wanted me to shrink, to play the fragile widow so she could step in as savior. But I was not fragile. I had been the backbone of this family long before she was born, and I would be the backbone still, even if it meant standing alone. That night I wrote in the notebook, "She parades strangers, spreads rumors, builds her army. But she forgets, I built mine years ago. And now it's time to call them back." Margaret was waiting for me with her kitchen table cleared and a calculator set out like a weapon, the old kind with big buttons that clacked loudly, every number hammered into reality. She listened as I laid out the story: my daughter's attempts, the missing checkbook, the forged signature, the strangers paraded into my house, and she didn't gasp, she didn't sigh, she only nodded slowly, the way someone does when puzzle pieces finally line up. "She's building a case, informal maybe, but still a case," Margaret said. "If enough people repeat the same story, it becomes fact, and fact moves faster than truth." I felt my stomach twist because I had lived that in whispers already. "So what do I do?" I asked. Margaret pulled out a folder of forms, the kind that smell faintly of toner and old ink. "First, you make your money untouchable. Separate accounts, in your sole name, with clear paper trails. Second, you create your own witnesses. Every transaction, every decision, documented and initialed. You don't just survive this, you outdocument her." We spent hours moving through the numbers, shifting savings into certificates, redirecting automatic deposits into the credit union 2 towns over, closing loopholes she might wriggle through. Margaret had me sign forms in triplicate, each one notarized, stamped, sealed. By evening I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral: control. "She can scream and gossip all she wants," Margaret said firmly, "but she can't move numbers that don't belong to her." When I came home, my daughter was waiting at the table with takeout cartons and that brittle smile. "Where have you been all day?" she asked casually, too casually. "Out," I said. "With Margaret." The way her face froze told me she understood more than she admitted. She stabbed at her food with her fork, then said, "Mom, I just wish you'd trust me. Dad would have wanted us to work together." I laughed then, bitter and sharp. "Your father trusted me enough to leave it in my hands. If he wanted you to have it, he would have written your name on the check." Her eyes narrowed, the smile gone. "You're being cruel," she whispered. "No," I said, "I'm being accurate." That night I found my bedroom drawers disturbed again. Nothing missing this time, but the neat stacks of clothes were crooked, the scent of her perfume faint in the air. She was hunting. I went straight to the notebook and wrote, "She searches when she thinks I sleep. Next time, proof." And so the following evening I placed a small camera, borrowed from Margaret's grandson, on the bookshelf facing my bedroom door. 2 nights later the footage showed her slipping into my room, gloved hands opening drawers, flipping through papers, muttering under her breath. When I confronted her the next morning, she didn't even deny it. "If you won't let me help, I'll have to protect you from yourself," she said coldly. "You're not thinking straight. You're grieving." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Grief doesn't make me stupid. Greed does. Be careful which side of that you're standing on." She flushed, then stormed out, slamming the door so hard a frame fell from the wall. The next Sunday she cornered me in the garden. "If you don't sign something soon, Mom, you're going to lose more than money. You'll lose me." She said it like a threat wrapped in love, but all I heard was the hunger beneath. I stood tall, dirt on my gloves, the roses sharp with thorns behind me, and said, "Then I guess I will keep the money and bury the loss." For the first time, she didn't answer. She just stared, her mouth tight, and walked away. That night I opened the notebook and wrote in thick letters, "She has grown reckless. She searches openly. She threatens abandonment. Good. Reckless people make mistakes, and mistakes leave trails." And as I set down the pen, I realized something else. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. This was about teaching her that love without respect is nothing but a hollow word, and I would not be hollowed out for anyone, not even my own child. The call came on a Wednesday morning, sharp as a knife through the quiet. 2 officers at my door, polite but firm, asking if they could check on me. Someone had called in a wellness report, claiming I was confused, possibly unsafe in my own home. I didn't need to ask who made the call. I could hear my daughter's voice written between every line of their clipboard. I invited them in, offered tea, and watched them glance around, expecting chaos. But the bills were stacked neatly on the counter, my pantry was organized, the calendar on the wall marked with doctor appointments and grocery runs. One officer asked gently, "Do you live alone?" And I said, "Alone, but not helpless." When they asked if I had any proof of my routines, I opened my notebook, the pages filled with dates, payments, names, even the times she had shown up uninvited. I showed them the video clip too, her sneaking into my bedroom with gloves, rifling through my drawers. The older officer's mouth tightened. "Ma'am, this doesn't look like someone confused. This looks like someone being harassed." They left with polite nods, but I knew word would travel, and not in the way she expected. That evening she came storming through the door, eyes blazing. "You embarrassed me," she snapped. "Do you know how it looks when the police show up and tell me you accused me?" I set the remote on the table and leaned back. "I didn't accuse you." The camera did. Her face froze. "You filmed me?" she hissed. "I protected myself," I said calmly. "Because I knew one day you'd call men with badges instead of men in suits." She paced the kitchen, wringing her hands. You don't understand, Mom. You'll lose it all if you're not careful. I'm the only one trying to save you. I stood, slow but steady, and said, no. You're the only one trying to take from me. The next day she arrived with reinforcements, my cousin Tom and Aunt Lisa, faces solemn, voices dripping with false concern. We're worried about you, Lisa said. Your daughter tells us you're not yourself. Tom added, maybe you should let her take some of the burden. I laughed, sharp enough to cut the room in half. Burden? The only burden here is her greed. She forged my signature. She stole my checkbook. She called the police to paint me weak. And I have proof. Their eyes widened, and before she could cut me off, I set my phone on the table and played the clip of her sneaking through my drawers. The silence afterward was thick, broken only by the faint sound of her own voice muttering on the recording. Tom shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know it was like this. Aunt Lisa frowned, looking at her with disappointment sharper than any anger. My daughter's face went crimson, her lips trembling as she tried to find footing. She's manipulating you, she spat, pointing at me. She's writing everything down, filming everything, making herself look sane. The room hung on her words, and she must have realized too late how they sounded, because Tom muttered, that doesn't sound like a crazy woman. That sounds like someone protecting herself. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. The relatives followed, murmuring excuses, their sympathy no longer hers. I sat at the table and breathed for the first time in days. She had wanted me isolated, but instead she had shown her hand, too loud, too reckless, too desperate. The mask was cracking, and the cracks were spreading fast. That night I wrote in the notebook, police came, found order. Family came, saw truth. Her army is crumbling. Her voice is shrill, mine is steady. The tide is turning. For the first time since my husband's death, I slept without waking at every creak of the house. Because I knew now, I was not only surviving. I was winning. By early summer the mask had slipped completely. She no longer bothered with smiles or soft words, only demands spoken in a clipped voice that trembled at the edges. One evening she appeared without knocking, her keys jangling like handcuffs, and marched straight into the kitchen. Enough of this charade, she snapped, dropping a stack of forms on the table. You're going to sign these. It's a transfer, nothing complicated. Once it's done, you won't have to worry anymore. I didn't even look at the papers. I looked at her face, flushed and desperate, and said, the only thing I worry about is how little my daughter thinks of me. Her lips curled. You're playing a dangerous game. Do you think money keeps you safe? It doesn't. People can disappear into nursing homes overnight. The threat hung between us like smoke. I stood, slow and deliberate, and pointed to the door. Leave, I said. For a second she hesitated, then swept the papers back into her bag and stormed out, muttering curses. My hands shook as I locked the door behind her, but my resolve had never been steadier. I wasn't afraid of institutions or threats. I was afraid of what I would become if I bent now. 2 days later I noticed my jewelry box had been disturbed. My wedding ring, the one I hadn't had the courage to wear since the funeral, was gone. My daughter called later that night, her voice syrupy, asking, "How are you holding up, Mom? Did you lose something?" My stomach turned. She wanted me to accuse her, to sound paranoid, to give her more ammunition. Instead I said, "No, I haven't lost anything worth keeping." But when I hung up I went to my notebook and wrote, "Ring stolen. Likely pawned." Proof of her hunger. The next weekend I found her in my living room rifling through my desk drawers like she owned the house. I snapped a photo with my phone before she noticed. When I confronted her, she spun around, eyes wild. "You're trying to ruin me," she shouted. "You want people to think I'm a thief. Do you realize what people will say when I tell them you're delusional?" I raised my phone higher, screen glowing. "Let them talk," I said. "I have the picture. I have the videos. I have everything." She froze, her breath shallow, then sneered. "You wouldn't dare expose your own daughter." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You're not my daughter when you act like this. You're just another stranger trying to rob me." That night she sent a text, long and frantic. "You'll regret this. You'll end up alone. You'll die bitter and broke." I stared at the words glowing in the dark and felt an odd calm wash over me. She was unraveling, and her unraveling was my shield. The next morning I took the phone to Margaret and asked her to print every message, every screenshot. We slipped them into the growing file. Margaret looked at me over her glasses and said, "She's giving you all the rope she'll hang herself with." By now even the neighbors had begun to whisper in my favor. Carl came by with tomatoes from his garden and said, almost apologetically, "I think I judged you wrong. She's been intense, hasn't she?" I smiled faintly. Intense is one word for it. The truth was leaking through the cracks she made herself. That night, in the stillness of the house, I took out my husband's photo from the box where I'd hidden it after the funeral. I placed it back on the mantel, the empty space finally filled again. "She thinks she's fighting me," I whispered to his smile, "but she's fighting us. And she's going to lose." In the notebook I wrote, threats spoken. Ring gone. Photo taken. Evidence piling. She thinks fear will silence me. But I am not silent. Not anymore. It happened on a Monday morning, gray skies pressing against the windows, when the phone rang from my bank. The voice on the other end was cautious, polite. "Mrs. Vale, we just wanted to confirm you came in this morning to request a full withdrawal." My heart dropped like a stone. I had not been to the bank. I told the clerk no, absolutely not, and he cleared his throat. "That's what I thought, the signature didn't match exactly. We've frozen the request until we could speak with you." I hung up, shaking, and within an hour my daughter was at the door, face flushed, voice high-pitched. "Mom, what did you tell them? You're embarrassing me, making me look like a criminal." I didn't open the door. I shouted through it, "You don't need my help for that. You're doing fine on your own." That afternoon I checked my desk and found more missing, copies of my identification, old utility bills, even a spare bank card I hadn't used in years. She was preparing to become me on paper. Rage steadied me more than fear ever could. I went straight to Margaret, who by now kept a file cabinet just for my case, and together we called the bank, added layers of protection, passwords, secondary IDs. "She can't be you if you refuse to vanish," Margaret said firmly. The next evening my daughter came storming in without knocking, eyes wild. "Give me the account numbers," she snapped. "This money isn't safe with you. You'll waste it. You'll die and it'll rot." I stood in the kitchen with the knife still in my hand from chopping onions, and for the first time she seemed to see me as something other than prey. I set the knife down carefully, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "The only thing rotting here is your soul." She lunged forward, grabbed at the drawer where I kept my folders, but I slammed it shut and shouted, "Get out." For a moment I thought she might strike me, but instead she hissed, "You'll regret this," and stormed away, slamming the door so hard the glass shook. 2 nights later the police knocked again. There was a report of elder neglect, they said. That you were leaving bills unpaid, that your house was unsafe. I didn't flinch. I invited them in, offered tea, and walked them through every room. The bills were stacked, stamped paid, the locks secure, the pantry stocked. Then I pulled out my folder, showed them the video still of her rifling my drawers, the screenshot of her text messages threatening me, the bank's letter confirming her failed attempt at withdrawal. The older officer rubbed his temple. Looks like you're the one under attack, ma'am. They left with apologies, and I felt a grim satisfaction settle into my bones. But the true breaking point came from her own son. My grandson knocked on my door the next day, hesitant, eyes wide. He climbed onto the chair across from me and whispered, "Mom said you're sick. That you can't handle things." But I saw her yelling at you. I saw her take your ring. Tears burned my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. You must remember this, sweetheart, seeing is believing. Always believe what you see, not what people tell you. He nodded, his face pale, and in that moment I knew the war was already lost for her. Because once a child sees through a parent's mask, the cracks never close again. That night she sent me one last message: if you don't hand it over, I'll make sure you lose everything. You'll end up with nothing but your notebook. I laughed out loud in the empty house. The notebook had become my fortress, and she didn't realize every word in it was another brick in the wall against her. I wrote on the next page, she has tried forgery, theft, threats, lies. She has used police, family, neighbors, even her own child. But all she's built is her own noose. Soon the world will see it. And when that happens, I won't need to take the money from her hands. She will drop it herself, too heavy to carry anymore. By midsummer the mask was gone completely, stripped away by her own hands. She no longer pretended to be the dutiful daughter, no longer coated her words with sugar. She came to the house red-faced, trembling, clutching a folder stuffed with papers. "If you won't give it to me," she shouted before I could even close the door, "then I'll make everyone believe you're incompetent. I'll show them you've lost it." She slammed the folder down on the table. Inside were photocopies of bills, some with lines highlighted, some overdue notices she must have printed herself, and a stack of forged notes in my handwriting that read things like "can't remember password" and "forgot to pay again." She had tried to create a paper trail of senility. I laughed. A deep, bitter laugh that seemed to shake her more than anger ever could. "Do you think paper makes a lie true?" I asked, pulling open my drawer and slamming down my own folder, neatly tabbed statements, signed receipts, letters from the bank with security passwords, screenshots of her texts, the photograph of her rummaging through my desk. I flipped it open to the video stills, her gloved hands tugging at my drawers, her face caught mid-grimace. "This is truth," I said. "Your father always told me, ink never lies. You should have remembered that before you tried to forge my hand." She went pale, then flushed crimson, and screamed, "You're ruining me." At that moment the doorbell rang. Margaret stepped in with 2 neighbors behind her, Carl and Mrs. Green, arms full of produce they'd brought me from their gardens. They stopped cold, watching my daughter shrieking, red-faced, papers scattered across the floor. "She's insane," my daughter cried, pointing at me. "She's delusional, dangerous," but Mrs. Green cut her off sharply. "Enough. We've seen you, dear. We've all seen you." Carl nodded, his voice low but steady. "The police saw it too. The whole town knows." My daughter's mouth opened and closed like a drowning fish. She backed away, hands shaking. "You're all against me," she whispered, then louder, "This is a setup." But Margaret, calm and firm, held up the thick file of my records. "No, sweetheart. This is accountability." She stormed out then, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The house fell quiet, only the sound of her engine roaring down the street. Margaret laid a hand on mine. "She's finished. Whatever mask she wore, she tore it off herself today." That evening I sat with my grandson in the garden. He picked a tomato from Carl's basket and held it in his small hands. "Mom's so angry," he said quietly. "She says you're taking everything away from her." I pulled him close, kissed his hair. "I'm not taking anything. I'm only keeping what's mine. What your grandfather worked for. What's meant to keep me safe, not feed someone's greed." He nodded, eyes solemn beyond his years. That night I opened my notebook and wrote in large, heavy strokes, "Today she screamed. Today she was seen. Today she lost the last of her mask. The neighbors know, the town knows, her own child knows. She cannot hide anymore." And for the first time since the funeral, I felt not just survival but triumph, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need applause, only the knowledge that truth had finally stepped into the light and burned away her lies. After that day something shifted, not only in my house but in the whole town. My daughter must have thought she could shout the walls down, but instead she had torn them open, and now everyone could see what was inside. Word spread faster than she could patch it. At church she walked in with her chin high, but the whispers followed her like a shadow. Mrs. Green turned her back when she tried to greet her. Carl crossed his arms and refused to shake her hand. Even Pastor Ron, who had once taken her side, kept his sermon tightly fixed on "Honor thy father and mother" while pointedly staring at her pew. She squirmed, her face blotched red, and for the first time I saw her small. She tried to rally allies, but one by one they slipped away. Aunt Lisa stopped calling. Cousin Tom sent me a note apologizing for doubting me. Even her so-called financial advisor never returned to town after Margaret sent him a neatly packaged folder of my daughter's threats, screenshots, and forged papers. He wanted no part in her unraveling. At home her anger burned hotter but shorter, like matches striking one after another. She left voicemails I didn't answer, each one more frantic. "You'll be alone forever. No one will believe you. You'll lose it all." Then, quieter, "Please, Mom, just let me handle it. I can fix this." But her voice cracked, and I could hear the desperation underneath. I saved every word, every voicemail, every message. Not out of fear anymore, but out of habit. My notebook had become more than protection. It was my testament. The sharpest cut came from her own son. One afternoon my grandson sat across from her at the dinner table. I know this because later he told me, and he asked, "Why do you keep saying Grandma is crazy?" "She's not. I saw you yelling at her. I saw you take her things." She slapped her fork down so hard it clattered, but he didn't flinch. "Grandma told me to believe what I see," he said. "And I saw you." After that he spent more time at my house, choosing the safety of my kitchen over hers. She noticed, of course. She called me screaming, accusing me of poisoning him against her. But you can't poison with truth. You can only reveal. It was in those weeks that I felt the strangest kind of victory. Not loud, not celebrated, but heavy and quiet. I had not only kept the money, though yes, every cent was still mine, safeguarded in Margaret's careful files. I had kept my dignity. I had shown her that grief does not equal weakness, that widowhood does not mean surrender. But the victory was bitter too, because it had cost me my daughter. She no longer came by except to shout from the driveway, no longer spoke except to send jagged texts that I no longer bothered to read. She was gone long before she ever left, hollowed out by her own hunger. One evening I stood in my husband's study, touching the frame of his photograph. "She wanted to take what you left me," I whispered. "She forgot that what you truly left me was strength." I swear for a moment I could hear his laugh, the one that had carried me through decades of storms. That night I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "She has lost her mask, her allies, her son. I have lost her, but not myself. The balance is heavy but fair." And for the first time since the funeral, I blew out the candle by my bed and slept without dreaming of signatures, locks, or shadows in my drawers. Because the war was nearly over, and I was still standing. The war ended not with a bang but with silence. Weeks passed, and she stopped coming altogether. No more slamming doors, no more staged accidents, no more folders shoved across my table. Her absence felt strange at first, like standing in a room where a loud clock had always ticked, and suddenly the air was still. One morning I realized her key no longer scraped in my lock, because I had changed it. I sat with my coffee, staring at the quiet house, and thought, so this is what peace sounds like. The town had made its verdict long before she left. Whispers turned into pitying glances, then into avoidance. Neighbors who once nodded politely began crossing the street to keep distance from her. Even family members pulled back. Aunt Lisa told me softly over tea, "She burned too many bridges, honey." People don't forgive that easily. My daughter's name became something spoken with sighs, never with smiles. She had exiled herself with her greed, and I had only stood still long enough for her to reveal it. My grandson came often, slipping through my garden gate after school. He would sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I cooked, the air filled with the ordinary music of pencils scratching and pots simmering. One afternoon he looked up and said, "Grandma, is it true Mom tried to take your money?" I set down the spoon, sat across from him, and chose my words carefully. "She tried to take what wasn't hers. But you must understand, sometimes people confuse love with wanting control. It's not your fault, and it's not mine. It's her choice." He nodded slowly, and I saw a wisdom far too heavy for a boy his age. "I believe you," he said simply. And that was worth more than every zero on that insurance check. I took Margaret's advice and made my finances airtight, accounts in my sole name, passwords tucked safely in my notebook, copies hidden in 3 different places. I wasn't guarding against thieves anymore. I was honoring the sweat and years my husband had poured into that money. It wasn't just currency. It was his last gift, his final assurance that I would not be left helpless. And I guarded it like I guarded his memory, with vigilance, and with love. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if my daughter would ever return, contrite, asking forgiveness. But I knew even then, forgiveness is not a door that swings open just because someone knocks. Forgiveness must be earned. And she had never tried to earn it. She wanted shortcuts, signatures, silence. I would not give her those. What I had given her all her life, my love, my sacrifice, my trust, she had spent carelessly, like coins dropped into a storm drain. And I would not chase them into the dark. On the last page of my notebook I wrote, "She is gone. The money remains. My dignity remains. My grandson remains. I remain." Then I closed it, slid it into the fireproof box with the deed to the house, and locked it away. I no longer needed to write to defend myself. The story was written, and it was mine. Now when I walk through the garden at dusk, I look at the roses, wild and thorned, and I think, she wanted to prune me, to cut me down, to harvest what was never hers. But I bloomed anyway. Alone, perhaps. Wounded, yes. But still standing, still mine, still alive. And I whisper into the evening air, to my husband, to myself, to anyone who will listen. She tried to buy my silence with my own money. But I kept both. My voice and my life.